That night, I finally understood that the most dangerous lies are not the ones people tell strangers. They are the ones people tell the people who love them most. My name is Margaret. I am 63 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Hamilton, Ontario, the same house where I raised my son on a nurse's salary after his father passed. It is not a grand house. The driveway cracks every spring from the frost, and I patch it myself every summer. The kitchen window looks out over a strip of backyard where I grow tomatoes and mint. It is a modest life, and I have always been proud of it. But this story is not about my house. It is about the night I stood up in a room full of people who expected me to stay silent, and I chose not to. Before I tell you what I did, let me tell you how I got there, because what happened at that party did not begin that night. It began nearly a year earlier, on a Thursday evening in late October, when my son walked through my front door, smiling in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager. I had not seen my son smile like that in years. He is 32. He works as a licensed electrician, union shop, steady work, good pay. He is not flashy. He drives a used pickup truck and he brings me soup when I am sick, and he has never once asked me for anything he did not earn. He sat down at my kitchen table and wrapped his hands around a mug of tea and told me about her. He told me she was studying landscape architecture at McMaster. He told me she had grown up in Oakville and that her family had money, real money, the kind you can see in the driveway. He told me she did not care about any of that she laughed at his jokes, that she helped him carry lumber when he was finishing the deck at his apartment, that she had never once asked him how much he made or where he saw himself in 10 years the way every other woman he dated eventually did. He told me her name. He told me her father ran one of the largest private real estate development companies in the Greater Toronto area. I poured more tea and listened and smiled and told him to bring her over for dinner, but somewhere underneath the happiness I felt for him, something small and quiet started turning. The first time I met her, I understood immediately why my son loved her. She arrived at my door holding a jar of local honey from a farm stand in Dundas because my son had mentioned I put honey in my tea. She helped me chop vegetables without being asked. She asked about the photos on my wall, and when I told her that the man in the uniform was my husband, my son's father, she said she was sorry and she meant it. She was warm, she was real, but when she talked about her father, something shifted in her voice, just slightly, the way a person's voice shifts when they are describing someone they love and fear in equal measure. "My dad is very particular," she said, moving her fork around her plate. "He has a certain idea of what he wants from me. He does not always say things the way he means them." I asked what her father thought about my son. She looked down. "He does not know yet that we are serious." That knot in my stomach tightened. Months passed. My son and my future daughter-in-law became something real and solid. He called me every Sunday. He came for dinner every second week. He was the happiest I had seen him since before his father died, and I should have been able to simply be happy with him. But her father was always there, at the edge of the story, like a shadow in a photograph you cannot quite identify. The first time I met him was at a dinner her family hosted in early spring. The house in Oakville sat back from the road behind a long stone driveway. It was the kind of house designed to make you feel small before you even reached the front door. Her mother greeted us at the entrance. She was elegant and quiet, the kind of woman who has learned to fill silence with a gracious smile. Her father came in from another room with his hand already extended, as if he had timed the entrance. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, well-dressed, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent decades having people agree with him. He shook my son's hand and then mine and said it was lovely to meet us. But when he poured the wine and made a small toast to family, he looked at my son with an expression I recognized immediately. I had seen it before, in hospitals, on the faces of certain consultants when they spoke to the nurses. It was the look of someone who has already decided you are not worth taking seriously. Over dinner, he talked about his projects, a mixed-use development in Mississauga, a condominium tower going up near the waterfront in Burlington, a retirement community he was planning in the Niagara region. He talked about city councilors he knew by first name, about his company's revenue, about the awards his firm had received. When he finally turned to my son and asked what he did, and my son told him, the man nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not listening. "Good trade," he said. "Steady work. He said it the way someone says it when they mean the opposite. At the end of the evening, he pulled me aside. He said he wanted to speak frankly. He said his daughter was accustomed to a certain kind of life and that a man in the trades, however skilled, was unlikely to provide that over the long term. He said he hoped my son understood the responsibility he was taking on. He said all of this quietly, pleasantly, with a polished smile that never reached his eyes. I told him my son was one of the most responsible people I had ever known. I told him that character was worth more than any development portfolio. He nodded again with that same expression and excused himself to refill his glass. On the drive home, my son stared at the road and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "He does not think much of me, does he?" I did not lie to him. I said the man did not know him yet. But I was already thinking. I was already remembering something I had seen 2 weeks earlier and had not known what to do with. I had been at a restaurant in downtown Hamilton having lunch with a colleague when I noticed him. Her father, sitting across the room with a woman I did not recognize and 2 children who looked to be under 10 years old. He had his arm around her shoulders. The children called him Dad. He was laughing. I sat very still with my water glass and watched and said nothing. That night, after dropping my son off, I sat in my car in my driveway for 20 minutes. I thought about what I had seen. I thought about what it might mean. I thought about whether it was any of my business. And then I thought about my son's face on that drive home, and I knew that whatever I did next, I could not pretend I had not seen it. I called a friend from my nursing days who had gone through something similar with her husband years before. She gave me a name. Frank, she said. Discreet, professional, reasonable rates. Works out of an office above a print shop on Barton Street. I went to see him on a Tuesday afternoon. The office was small and tidy with a window that looked out over the street. Frank was a quiet man in his late 50s, former OPP, retired early. He asked me to tell him everything and he listened without interrupting. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he asked a few precise questions and told me he would need 2 weeks and would contact me when he had something. Those 2 weeks were among the hardest of my life. My son called me on Sunday as usual. He told me he was going to propose. He had already bought the ring. He had saved for 8 months. He was going to take her to the conservation area where they had walked on their second date in the early morning before the trails got busy. I told him it was a beautiful idea. I told him I was proud of him. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table and put my hands flat on the wood and breathed. Frank called me on a Wednesday evening. He said he needed me to come to the office. What I saw when he turned his monitor toward me made the room feel very far away. Photos of her father entering a condominium building in Etobicoke with the same woman I had seen at the restaurant. Photos of him at a park with the 2 children. Her father's name was on the lease of the apartment. The children were enrolled in a private school in North York. The fees were paid by a corporate account belonging to his development company. That is not all, Frank said. He opened a folder. Her father's company had been selected 3 years earlier to develop a mixed-income housing project outside of Brampton. The provincial government had committed funding. Buyers had paid deposits on 112 units. 41 units had been built. The rest were still a muddy field. Her father had drawn down the full construction financing and could not account for the shortfall. There were complaints filed with the Ontario New Home Warranties Plan. There was an active investigation by the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. The company owed nearly $9 million to trade creditors, including small subcontractors, including electricians, including people like my son. The company's lenders had begun issuing demand letters. The CRA had flagged irregularities in 4 consecutive years of corporate returns. How long until it collapses? I asked. Frank looked at his notes. 6 months. Maybe less if the investigation accelerates. I left the office and walked to my car and sat inside without starting the engine. The street was busy. People were going into the pharmacy, coming out of the laundromat, living ordinary lives. I sat there and thought about the families who had paid deposits and were still waiting for homes that were never coming. I thought about my future daughter-in-law, who loved her father with the kind of complicated, bruised love that daughters have for fathers who have never quite been what they needed. I thought about her mother, who sat quietly at that dinner table with her gracious smile while her husband was living a second life 40 minutes away. And I thought about my son, My good, patient, honest son, who was about to join a family built entirely on lies. I hired a lawyer the next morning. Not to take action, just to understand my options, to understand what I was holding. She was a woman I had met through the hospital, family and estate law, sharp and practical. I brought her the full file. She reviewed everything and looked up at me over her reading glasses. She said, "This is significant." She said, "If you go public with this, the consequences will be serious for everyone in that family, not just him." She said, "Are you certain this is what you want?" I told her I was not going to do anything yet. I told her I was going to wait and see. But I told her that if her father used any public occasion to humiliate my son, I would not stay quiet. She looked at me steadily and said she understood. She told me to be prepared for denial, for accusations, for being called unstable or jealous, or a liar. She told me to have copies of everything, in multiple places, ready to produce. I went home and made copies. I put originals in a safety deposit box at my branch on King Street. I put a set in a sealed envelope in the back of my filing cabinet. I put another set in a padded envelope in my coat closet, ready to carry. My son proposed on a Saturday morning in late May. She said yes. He called me from the trail, and I could hear the wind and his voice breaking with happiness, and I cried because my son deserved that happiness more than any person I knew. The engagement was announced. A party was planned. Her father insisted on hosting it at the private club he belonged to in Oakville, a place with mahogany walls and staff who moved in straight lines. He said he wanted to celebrate his daughter properly. My son told me he was uncomfortable with the extravagance, but that his fiancée wanted to keep the peace. I told him to let it go. I told him that some battles were not worth fighting before the war. The week before the party, my future daughter-in-law came to my house alone. She looked tired. She sat at my kitchen table and told me her father had been making comments. He had been telling her that a man in the trades had a ceiling. He had been suggesting that she would eventually want more. He had told her that he expected to give a speech at the party and that he had things he wanted to say. I asked what kind of things. She said she did not know exactly. She said she was worried he would embarrass my son. She said her father always needed an audience and always needed to be the most important person in any room. She said she was so tired of apologizing for him. I took her hands. I told her she did not need to apologize for her father. I told her she was not responsible for the things he chose to do. She looked at me with those steady, sad eyes and said she hoped the party would just go smoothly. I told her I hoped so too. But I took my padded envelope out of the coat closet that evening and put it in my handbag, just in case. The party was on a Friday evening in late June. The room at the club held about 150 people, her father's business associates, city contacts, a few relatives, and a small cluster of my son's friends and family who stood together near the windows, looking slightly underdressed and completely genuine. I sat at a round table with my son's aunt and a few of his colleagues. The room smelled of cedar and white wine. There were flowers on every surface. Someone had arranged for a string quartet. My son looked handsome and nervous in his good suit. His fiancée was beautiful. They held hands and moved through the room, and I watched her father work the crowd on the opposite side, moving from group to group with a politician's ease, touching shoulders, laughing loudly, drawing attention without appearing to seek it. Her mother sat near the windows. She looked lovely and vacant. I had never seen a woman so elegantly absent from a room she was physically present in. Dinner was served. The food was very good. I ate and said nothing and watched. When the plates were cleared, her father stood up and moved to the center of the room. A microphone stand had been set up. He straightened his jacket and smiled at the room, and the room smiled back, because that was what the room had been trained to do. He said he wanted to take a moment to celebrate his daughter, the light of his life, the pride of the family. He said she had always known her own mind, and he admired that about her, even when it drove him to distraction. People laughed warmly. Then he turned slightly toward my son, and his expression shifted. He said, "And she has brought us this young man, a tradesman, a man who works with his hands." He paused. "There is nothing wrong with that, of course. Honest work." He smiled. "But we always imagined something a little more for our daughter." He looked out at the room and let the silence hold for just a moment. "Still," she insisted. "And I have learned. after 30 years of marriage, that when a woman makes up her mind, there is very little a father can do. He raised his glass. So tonight I suppose I toast not just my daughter's engagement, but my own surrender. The room laughed. Several people clapped. My son stared at the table. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the linen. His fiancée put her hand over his and said something quietly, but she was pale and her eyes were bright with the effort of not crying. I heard the laughter and I felt something inside me go very still. I stood up. I was not shaking. I had expected this. I had prepared for this. I picked up my handbag and I walked toward the microphone stand, and the room began to notice me, and the laughter softened and then stopped. Her father turned and saw me coming, and his smile went rigid. "Margaret," he said. He said it the way a person says a name when they are trying to sound gracious and are actually trying to issue a warning. I reached the microphone. I adjusted it to my height because I am shorter than he is. And then I looked at the room. I said, "My name is Margaret. I am the mother of the man your host just described as a surrender." I said it calmly and clearly, and I paused to let the room settle. "My son works every day with his hands," I said. "He pays his taxes. He pays his bills on time. He has never asked anyone for anything he did not earn. He has never taken money that did not belong to him. He has never looked a room full of people in the eye and lied to them." I paused again. I looked at her father. I said I had something I needed to share with everyone present because I believed they deserved to know who they were toasting tonight. Her father said very quietly, "You need to stop." I said I had been gathering information for several months and that what I had found was something that affected a great many people in this province. I opened my handbag and took out the envelope. I said that her father's development company had received full construction financing for a residential project outside Brampton. I said that 112 families had paid deposits. I said that 41 units had been built and that the rest of the money was gone, and that those families were still waiting, and that there was an active investigation by the financial regulator. The room had gone completely silent. Her father said, "That is absolutely false," and his voice was steady, but his face had gone the color of concrete. I said I had documentation. I said I had bank records, corporate filings, and correspondence. I held up the envelope and I said I had made copies for anyone who wished to review them. I said I also had something else to share. I said her father had been maintaining a second household for at least 4 years, an apartment in Etobicoke, 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. I said this was not a rumor. I said I had photographs and financial records showing corporate funds used to pay the lease and the school fees. The sound that came from her mother was very small and very terrible. Her father moved toward me. He said, "You have no idea what you are talking about," and he reached for the microphone. I stepped back and held it firmly, and I said I had every idea. I said the CRA investigation had been opened 14 months ago, and that his company was in technical insolvency, and that every person in this room who had done business with his firm or invested in his projects deserved to know that, before they raised another glass in his honor. I set the microphone down on the stand. I walked to the nearest table and placed a copy of the documents on the white linen. Then I walked to another table and placed another copy. People reached for them. People stood up. There was a sound in the room like the air going out of something. I walked back to my son. He was standing. His face was a question I did not know how to answer yet. I said, "I am sorry this is how it happened." I said, "I am sorry it could not have been different." I said, "I could not let him speak about you that way and say nothing. Not when I knew what I knew." My son looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, is all of that true?" I said, "Yes, all of it." He sat down slowly, like something had been removed from beneath him, and he looked at the table and did not speak. The room came apart around us. Her father was surrounded by people asking questions, some demanding, some bewildered. Her mother had left the table with her sister. Her father's business associates were on their phones. The string quartet had stopped playing. My future daughter-in-law found me near the door. Her eyes were red, but her face was composed in the way faces go when the grief is too big to express all at once. She said, "Is it true about the apartment, about the children?" I said yes. She stood very still. She said, "I always thought there was something. I always thought there were evenings that did not add up." She pressed her hands together. She said, "My mother." I said her mother was with her sister. I said her mother was not alone. She nodded slowly. She looked at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life, part devastation, part something like relief. She said, "Thank you for not staying quiet." Then she went to find her mother. I left the club at 11 o'clock. The summer air outside was warm and still. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. The valets moved in and out of the lamplight. Guests trickled out in clusters, speaking in low voices. I watched the building and thought about everything that had just happened, everything that was about to happen, everything that could not be undone. I drove home and unlocked my front door and sat in my kitchen in the dark. The tomatoes were visible through the window in the moonlight, small and green and patient. I thought about the families in Brampton who had paid for homes that did not exist. I thought about my future daughter-in-law growing up in that house in Oakville with a father who applauded himself every time he entered a room. I thought about her mother, who had sat beside a lie for 30 years. And I thought about my son, who had sat at that table with his hands flat on the linen and his jaw tight and had not said a word, because he was too good to make a scene. He did not call me that night. He did not call the next day. When I tried to reach him, it went to voicemail. I left one message. I said I was sorry for the way it happened. I said I was not sorry I did it. I said I would be here when he was ready. A week passed. Then 2. In the 3rd week, the story appeared in local news. The regulatory investigation became public. The families in Brampton were mentioned by name. A spokesperson for the Financial Services Regulatory Authority confirmed the case was ongoing. Her father issued a statement through a lawyer denying the allegations. It was the kind of statement that denies everything, while confirming, through its very precision, that the person issuing it knows exactly what they are denying. Her mother filed for separation within the month. I learned this from a friend who knew her sister. My future daughter-in-law called me 6 weeks after the party. She asked if she could come over. I said of course. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon. She looked thinner and steadier at the same time, the way people look when they have cried enough to clear something out of themselves. We sat in the garden. I made iced tea. She told me her mother was staying with her sister in Burlington for now. She told me her father had retained a criminal defense lawyer. She told me she had been in contact with one of the families from Brampton, a couple who had been waiting 3 years for a house that was supposed to be their first home. She said speaking to them had changed something in her, had made it real in a way that her own pain had not. She said, "I spent a long time being angry at you." I said I understood. She said, "But I kept thinking about all those people, and I kept thinking about what my father said that night, about my mother sitting there hearing it for the first time in a room full of people. And I thought, if it had come out another way, quietly behind closed doors, he would have denied it. He would have managed it. He would have found a way to make my mother doubt herself. This way, there was no managing it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I have to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why didn't you tell us before the party? Why did you wait?" I had thought carefully about my answer to this question for weeks, because I knew it would come, and I knew it deserved honesty. I said, "Because if I had told your fiancé before the party, he would have confronted your father privately, and your father would have had time to prepare. He would have hidden the documents, shifted the assets, found a story, and if I had told you, you would have been placed in an impossible position between your mother and your father before you had any proof." I said, "I also did not know for certain, until that night, that your father would do what he did. And when he did, I knew the moment had arrived. I said, I am not certain it was the right choice. I am only certain it was the choice I made and that I would make it again." She looked at the tomatoes for a while. She said, "I think I understand." She asked how my son was. I said he had not spoken to me. She said quietly, "He is processing." She said, "He is not angry at you. He is angry that the world turned out this way." She said, "Give him a little more time." He came to my door on a Thursday evening in September. He stood on the front step with his hands in his pockets and he looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was a boy and had broken something and did not know how to say so. I opened the door and he came inside and sat at the kitchen table and I made tea without asking and set it in front of him. He said, "I should not have shut you out." I said, "You were allowed." He said, "You were right. About all of it. I did not want you to be right, and so I was angry at you instead of at the situation." He wrapped his hands around the mug. He said, "Do you know how strange it is to realize that the person who was supposed to be protecting you and your future wife was actually destroying the lives of 112 strangers?" I said I could only imagine. He said, "Those people in Brampton. Some of them had saved for 10 years for those deposits." I said I knew. He said, "You protected all of them, not just me." I said I had only told the truth. The truth did the protecting. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I am going to marry her, Mom, if she will still have me. She has nothing to do with what her father did, and I love her, and that is not going to change." I said, "I know." And I said, "She is a remarkable woman." She had told him as much herself. He nodded. He drank his tea. He said, "We are going to have a small wedding. No club. No speeches. Just the people who actually belong there." I said that sounded exactly right. They married the following spring at a conservation area in the Dundas Valley, the same trails where he had proposed, 34 people. A justice of the peace. Lunch afterward at a restaurant in Westdale that had been her favorite since university. There were wildflowers on the tables. My son's colleagues from the union sat beside her mother, who was 3 months out of the marriage and looked quietly astonished to be free. The children ran on the grass after lunch. Someone put music on a phone, and 2 of the older aunts danced on the patio. When my son and I danced, he held me the way he used to when he was small and needed to be reassured, and he said, "Thank you, Mom, not just for what you did at the party, for everything, for raising me to be someone who does not run from the truth." I held him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the feeling. Her father's regulatory proceedings moved through the system over the following year. His lawyer negotiated a settlement that included a substantial repayment to affected buyers, sourced from the liquidation of company assets. Not everyone recovered everything they had lost. But most of the families in Brampton eventually received compensation, and the project was transferred to a new developer who completed the remaining units. I read about it in the local news and sat with my tea and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. The second family, the woman and the 2 children in Etobicoke, I learned about gradually through my daughter-in-law. Their mother had not known he was married. He had told her he was separated, that the divorce was ongoing, that the paperwork was complicated. When the truth emerged publicly, she had contacted a family lawyer and sought formal recognition of the children's financial claims against the estate. My daughter-in-law reached out to her. They met once, the 2 women, in a cafe in the city, and from what my daughter-in-law told me, it was quiet and careful and honest, and they left with an understanding, if not a warmth. The children were, by all accounts, not at fault. My daughter-in-law sent them gifts at Christmas. Her mother sold the house in Oakville and bought a townhouse in Burlington, close to her sister. She took a position with a charitable foundation she had always volunteered for, fundraising and coordination. The last time I saw her was at my grandchild's first birthday party, where she sat in the backyard in the late afternoon light, looking entirely like herself, for what I suspected was the first time in many years. Her father served a conditional sentence and community service for the financial offenses. He lost his company, his membership at the club, and the public reputation he had spent 30 years curating. My daughter-in-law visited him once, about a year after the trial. She came to my house afterward and sat in the garden and told me he had been very quiet and that he had said he was sorry in a way that did not sound like someone performing an apology. She said she had told him she needed time. She said she was not ready to forgive, but she was not carrying the weight of not forgiving either, and that was enough for now. I told her that was more wisdom than most people develop in a lifetime. She laughed and said she had learned from watching me sit in that club with a sealed envelope in my handbag and wait for the right moment. I told her the right moment is not always the comfortable moment. I told her it is the honest one. My grandchild was born the following February, a girl with her father's eyes and her mother's deliberate way of examining everything around her, as if she is already deciding what she thinks. They named her Lily. After the first weeks when I held her in the hospital, and she curled her fingers around one of mine and held on, I sat in the corridor outside the maternity ward and allowed myself to cry in the way I had not allowed myself to cry at any point through the preceding year and a half. I cried because my son was safe and happy. I cried because my daughter-in-law had her truth at last, all of it, unmanaged and unmedicated by her father's version of events. I cried because I thought about all those Thursdays and Sundays when I had carried that padded envelope in my coat closet and asked myself whether I was doing the right thing. I cried because the answer was still yes, and because yes had cost more than I expected and given more than I had dared hope. There are people who told me, afterward, that I should have found a quieter way, that a party was not the place, that I had humiliated a man in public, and that no good could come from public humiliation. I listened to all of them. I considered what they said. And I came back, every time, to the same question. If I had found a quiet way, a private way, a careful way, would the regulatory investigation have moved faster? Would those families have seen their deposits any sooner? Would her mother have had the clarity to leave, or would she have accepted whatever story he offered and stayed? Because a man like that always has a story ready. I do not know the answer to any of those questions with certainty. I only know what I chose and why. And I know that I would choose the same way again, not because I am certain I was right, but because I am certain I could not live with having been silent. On a Sunday afternoon last winter, my son brought Lily to my house, and we walked along the waterfront trail while the lake was still frozen at the edges, and the sky was the particular pale blue it gets in February in Hamilton. He pushed the stroller and I walked beside him, and we did not talk for a while, which is one of the things about my son, that he can be quiet with you in a way that feels like companionship. He said, "Eventually, I think about those people in Brampton sometimes. The ones who waited for their houses." I said I did too. He said, "I want Lily to understand that someday, that it is not enough to do right by your family, that the world is connected, and what one person does with their power affects people they will never meet." I said, "She will understand it. You will teach her." He said, "You will help." I said I intended to. We walked the rest of the trail in that comfortable quiet, and I looked at the lake and the sky and the bare trees and thought about the past 2 years, about the night at the club and the room going silent, about standing at the microphone with my voice steady and my hands calm and the envelope open on the table, about my son not calling me for 6 weeks and what that silence had felt like, about my daughter-in-law in my garden saying she was angry at me and then saying she understood. I thought about the woman who pays for those deposits in Brampton, whose name I do not know, who has a house now that she paid for honestly and waited for without quitting. I thought about her mother in Burlington, running fundraising campaigns and eating dinner with her sister and being her own person in the evenings. And I thought about what my son had just said, about the world being connected, about power and responsibility, about what we owe the people we will never meet. I am 63 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Hamilton with tomatoes in the backyard and a crack in the driveway that comes back every spring. I am not wealthy. I am not important. I did not go to the club that night with any illusion that I was someone who mattered in the way that man thought he mattered. I went as a mother. I stayed as a witness. I spoke as someone who had been handed a truth too large to keep private. If you are listening to my story, if you have been in a room where someone expected you to stay quiet, if you have been handed information that was uncomfortable and inconvenient and that asked something of you that you were not sure you could give, I want you to know something I have come to believe with everything I have. Silence is a choice. It feels safe and it is not. It protects the people who are already protected. It costs the people who can least afford it. And it never, in my experience, prevents the explosion. It only delays it, and in the delay, more people are hurt. The truth is not always gentle. It is not always well-timed. It is not always received with gratitude. It cost me 6 weeks with my son and my own sleep for a 1.5 years, and the judgment of people whose opinions I used to care about. But it gave me my son back, and my daughter-in-law, and a granddaughter named Lily who holds my finger in the hospital corridor, and the knowledge, which I carry quietly every day, that when I was asked to decide who I was, I chose correctly. That is all I have. That is everything.